The Ashes of Defeat and the Race for the Future, May 8, 1945. 09 hours. Leck Airfield, Schleswig-Holstein, northern Germany. The silence is the first thing that hits you. For 6 years, the air has been a chaotic symphony of air raid sirens, the thrum of Daimler-Benz engines, and the terrifying shriek of falling bombs. But this morning, the silence is heavy. It presses down on the tarmac like a physical weight. Thick, oily smoke billows from behind the hangars, staining the grey spring sky. It's not from an Allied strafing run, not this time. It's the smell of burning history. German ground crews, their faces smeared with soot and exhaustion, are frantically tossing flight logs, technical schematics and maintenance records into makeshift bonfires. They are erasing the Luftwaffe. Parked in neat, defiant rows along the runway are the survivors. They look alien against the backdrop of a crushed Germany. These aren't the clumsy biplanes of the Great War, or the propeller-driven Messerschmitt 109s that terrorized Europe in 1940. These are sharks. Sleek, swept-wing predators with engines that don't spin a prop, but inhale air and spit fire. The Messerschmitt Me 262 Schwalde, the world's first operational jet fighter. A jeep tears across the runway, mud spraying from its tires. It screeches to a halt near the lead aircraft. An American colonel steps out, his uniform crisp compared to the ragged men surrounding him. This is Colonel Harold E. Watson, a man with a very specific shopping list and a very tight deadline. He doesn't care about the defeated pilots slumped against the hangar walls. He stares at the jets. He runs a gloved hand over the cold duralumin skin of the nearest 262. To the infantry, the war is over. But for Watson and the secretive unit known as the Air Technical Intelligence, a new war has just begun. The prize in the rubble. The chaotic days immediately following VE Day were not filled with peace. They were filled with panic. While the world celebrated, intelligence teams from the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union were engaged in a desperate, high-stakes scavenger hunt. The code name for the American effort was Operation Lusty, Luftwaffe, Secret Technolog. Watson's mandate was clear but nearly impossible: secure the black jets. You have to understand the sheer technological gap that existed in that moment. Allied pilots had reported seeing these German jets streak past them at speeds that defied physics over 540 miles per hour, leaving the fastest Mustangs and Spitfires looking like they were standing still. The Allies had won the war with numbers and logistics, but the Germans had nearly changed the game with engineering. At airfields like Leck and Lagerlachfeld, the scene was surreal. Luftwaffe pilots, the elite Jagdflieger, were surrendering not with white flags, but with their aircraft. Some, like the legendary ace Hans Fay, defected explicitly to hand over their technology to the Americans rather than let it fall into Soviet hands. But the danger wasn't gone. The airfields were booby-trapped. Many aircraft were rigged with explosives wired to the landing gear. One wrong step by an eager GI looking for a souvenir and a priceless prototype, and the GI would vanish in a fireball. Watson had to rely on the very men he had been fighting days ago. He needed the black men, the highly skilled German mechanics, named for their dark overalls, to show him how to fly, maintain, and disarm these beasts. It was a tense, uneasy alliance. In the mess halls, American pilots sat across from Luftwaffe veterans who, weeks prior, would have tried to kill them. Now, they traded cigarettes for secrets on how to start the volatile Jumo 04 jet engines without melting the turbine blades, the harvest of scraps. It wasn't just the jets. The directive expanded rapidly. The Allies were looking for the weird, the wonderful, and the terrifying. Deep in the forests of Bavaria and hidden in salt mines in Austria, they found things that looked like they belonged in a science fiction magazine. They found the Arado R-20 Thorfall, a jet bomber with a glazed nose that looked like a dragonfly. They stumbled upon the Heinkel He-162 Volksjäger, a tiny wooden jet fighter meant to be flown by Hitler Youth with barely any training. But the most chilling discovery was often what wasn't finished. In a hangar near Friedrichsthal, troops uncovered the Horten Ho-229. It was a flying wing, a bat-like aircraft with no tail, coated in special paint that some claimed was designed to absorb radar waves. It was the grandfather of the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, sitting there in 1945, a silent testament to how close the Luftwaffe came to a completely different kind of air superiority. The logistics of moving these prizes were a nightmare. Watson formed a unit quickly dubbed Watson's Whizzers. Their job was to take these experimental, often sabotage-ridden German planes and fly them out of Germany to the coast of France. Imagine the nerves of those American pilots. You are strapping yourself into an enemy aircraft with cockpit gauges labeled in a language you don't speak, relying on a mechanic who might hate you to fly a plane that has a reputation for exploding if you throttle up too fast. Every flight was a gamble. Engines flamed out, landing gears collapsed, but they kept flying them out, one by one, ferrying the future of aviation to the port of Cherbourg. The clock is ticking by June 1945. The atmosphere shifted from recovery to frantic evacuation. The geopolitical map was being redrawn. The Yalta Conference had divided Germany into zones of occupation. A terrible realization hit Watson's team. A massive cache of German aircraft and research facilities was located in what was designated to become the Soviet occupation zone. The Soviets were moving west, and they were hungry for the same technology. The Red Army had its own trophy brigades, stripping everything bare: factories, scientists, even the railway tracks. Watson received a back-channel order: get everything out. Now, they weren't just taking planes anymore, they were stripping the infrastructure. At the Nordhausen underground factory, where V-2 rockets were built by slave labor, American troops worked around the clock to crate up tons of documents and parts before the Russians arrived. On the airfields, it became a race against the calendar. Planes that couldn't be flown were dismantled and shoved onto trucks. Prototypes that were too damaged to move were doused in gasoline and burned, just so Stalin wouldn't have them. As the last convoy of Watson's Whizzers roared off the tarmac at Merseburg, dust kicking up in the twilight, a Soviet advance guard was reportedly less than 10 miles away. The Iron Curtain was descending, and the Luftwaffe's legacy was being split in half. The Americans had their prize, a fleet of captured Eagles waiting at the French port of Cherbourg to be loaded onto the British aircraft carrier HMS Reaper, but getting them to the coast was the easy part. Now they had to get these volatile, deterioration-prone machines across the Atlantic Ocean, and not all of them would make it. The voyage of the Reaper and the flight of the enemy, July 19th, 1945, 14:07 hours. Cherbourg Harbour, France. The smell of the Atlantic mixes with the sharp tang of coal smoke and diesel. Above the dark waters of the harbour, a crane groans under the weight of a metal carcass. Dangling in the air, suspended by heavy cables, is a twin-engine Heinkel He-219 Uhu. It slowly rotates in the wind, its radar antennas looking like the whiskers of a giant insect. Below it, the flight deck of the HMS Reaper looks less like an aircraft carrier and more like a parking lot for the apocalypse. This British escort carrier has been loaned to the Americans for a singular mission: to transport the greatest accumulation of enemy aeronautical technology in history. Jammed onto the deck are over 40 captured German aircraft. You can see the distinct shapes of Me-262s, their noses wrapped in protective tarpaulins. There are Arado jet bombers, Focke-Wulf 190s, and even weird experimental helicopters like the Flettner Fleet-2. It is a surreal zoo of mechanical beasts. American sailors lean over the railings, staring at the swastikas still painted on the tail fins. Just months ago, seeing these silhouettes on the horizon meant you manned the anti-aircraft guns and prayed. Now they are cargo, but the ocean doesn't care about technology. The Atlantic is a harsh environment for delicate prototypes. The Whizzers and the ground crews have done their best to cocoon the planes, sealing sensitive ports and engines against the corrosive salt spray. As the Reaper casts off and turns its bow toward Newark, New Jersey, the real danger isn't enemy U-boats anymore, it's the weather. If a storm hits, These priceless jets, some of which are the only surviving examples in the world, could be washed overboard or smashed against each other. The future of the United States Air Force is currently lashed to a wooden deck, bobbing in the middle of the ocean. Freeman Field, the Devil's Playground. Fast forward to late summer 1945. The Reaper has survived the crossing. The planes have been offloaded in Newark, towed through the streets much to the shock of New Jersey commuters, and transported to their new homes. While some go to Wright Field in Ohio for teardown analysis, the operational heart of the testing program beats at Freeman Field, Indiana. This place quickly earns a reputation. To the locals, it's just an airbase. To the pilots stationed there, it is the most dangerous flying club on Earth. This is the Foreign Equipment Evaluation Center. Imagine walking onto the flight line at Freeman Field in September 1945. It looks like the Luftwaffe has invaded Indiana. There are rows upon rows of German aircraft, but the men climbing into the cockpits aren't named Hans or Fritz. They are American test pilots, the best of the best, guys with nerves of steel and no fear of death. Men like Captain Bob Hoover and the young Chuck Yeager are here. They are about to engage in the most hazardous flying of their careers. Why? Because these planes are tired. They are war-weary. They were built by slave labor in underground caves, often with sabotaged parts, and they have been sitting in the rain for months. The rubber seals are rotting. The wiring is brittle, and there are no flight manuals. The black men, the German mechanics brought over via Operation Paperclip Air to help, but the language barrier is thick. Often, a pilot is strapped into a jet that holds 400 gallons of highly volatile kerosene, and the only instruction he gets is a thumbs up from a mechanic who was an enemy combatant 4 months ago, riding the Tiger. The star of the show remains the Me-262. The Americans are desperate to understand it. They know it's fast, but they need to know why. You are in the cockpit with a test pilot. The canopy is clamped shut. The cockpit is cramped, smelling of old leather and oil. The layout is chaotic compared to the orderly American instrument panels. You press the starter button for the Jumo 004 jet engine. It doesn't roar to life. It whines. A high-pitched scream that sets your teeth on edge. You have to watch the temperature gauge like a hawk. If you introduce fuel too quickly, the engine will hot start, essentially melting the turbine blades into a glowing sludge in seconds. Takeoff is terrifying. The early jets have terrible acceleration. You eat up runway 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 feet. The trees at the end of the airfield rush toward you. Just when you think you're going to clip the treetops, the wings bite the air, and you lift off. And then, the revelation. Once in the air, the vibration stops. The propeller torque, the force that constantly tries to twist a piston plane to the side, is gone. It's smooth, it's quiet, and it is fast. American pilots are clocking speeds over 500 miles per hour in level flight. They are discovering the magic of the swept wing. The German engineers had angled the wings back to delay the shock waves of breaking the sound barrier. American engineers looked at this data and slapped their foreheads. They've been trying to build faster planes with straight wings, hitting a literal wall of physics. The Germans had simply gone around it. But the flights are short. The Jumo engines have a service life of roughly 10 to 25 hours. They are disposable. Every flight is a countdown to catastrophic engine failure. The scrap heap of history. By 1946, the initial ore was wearing off, replaced by cold, hard data extraction. The United States didn't want to build Me-262s. They wanted to steal the DNA and build something better. Engineers at Freeman Field and Wright Field tore the planes apart. They analyzed the metallurgy of the turbine blades. They studied the ejection seats, a concept almost alien to American designers at the time. They mapped the fuel injection systems. Once the secrets were harvested, the hardware became a liability. It is a heartbreaking image for any aviation enthusiast today. At Freeman Field, once the tests were done, these priceless machines weren't put in museums, not yet. They were pushed to the edge of the airfield. They were surplus. Cranes dropped heavy iron balls on the fuselages of Arado bombers. Bulldozers crushed the wings of Focke-Wulfs. The scrap metal was sold for pennies a pound. The very machines that had been hunted across Europe, transported across the Atlantic, and flown by legends were now being turned into soda cans and car fenders. But while the metal was being crushed in Indiana, a different kind of excavation was happening in the East. The Soviets hadn't managed to capture as many pristine aircraft as Watson's Whizzers, but they had captured something else. They had captured the molds. They had captured the factories. And they had captured the molds. They had captured the factories. And they had captured the men who drew the blueprints. While the Americans were test-flying captured relics, the Russians were building new ones. In a secret design bureau outside Moscow, a team of German engineers was standing over a drafting table, watched by armed guards. They were sketching a new fighter for the Soviet Air Force. It would have a swept wing, it would have a centrifugal flow engine, and when it finally appeared in the skies over Korea a few years later, it would look hauntingly familiar to the men who had studied the German Taube pigeon archives. The Americans thought the race was over because they had the trophies. They didn't realize that the ghost of the Luftwaffe was about to be reborn in the shape of the MiG-15. The Phantom Blueprint and the Red Dawn, November 1st, 1945. 08, 30 hours. North American Aviation Headquarters, Inglewood, California. The air in the drafting room is stale, thick with cigarette smoke and frustration. Dozens of engineers in white shirts and black ties are hunched over drafting tables, staring at the blueprints for the XP-86. It is supposed to be the Navy and Air Force's next great fighter. But there is a problem. The math doesn't add up. The design on the table looks like a fatter, faster P-51 Mustang. It has straight wings, and according to the wind tunnel data coming out of Caltech, this plane is going to hit a brick wall at 600 miles per hour. It's the compressibility wall. As the plane approaches the speed of sound, the air builds up in front of those straight wings like concrete. The controls lock up. The plane shakes violently. It is a dead end. Then the door swings open. A senior engineer walks in, carrying a heavy dossier stamped S.E. Scret, Operation Lusty. He doesn't say a word. He doesn't say a word. He walks over to the main drafting table, picks up the blueprints for the straight-wing XP-86, and unceremoniously dumps them into the trash can. He drops the dossier on the table. It spills open, revealing translated documents from the Messerschmitt archives captured at Oberammergau. "Gentlemen," he says, pointing to a diagram of a radical, swept-back wing design, "we are starting over. The Germans solved it 2 years ago." In that moment, the physical Luftwaffe planes rotting in Indiana ceased to matter. The spirit of the Luftwaffe was being injected directly into the veins of the U.S. Air Force. The engineers at North American Aviation did the unthinkable. They delayed a multi-million-dollar military contract to completely redesign their plane based on enemy homework. They swept the wings back 35 degrees. They added automatic leading-edge slats, a direct copy of the Me-262's system. From the ashes of the trash can, the F-86 Sabre was born. It was an American hero, but its DNA was distinctly German. The night of the long knives, while the Americans were studying papers in sunny California, a far darker scene was unfolding in the Soviet occupation zone of Germany. October 22nd, 1946. 4 hours. Dessau, Eastern Germany. You are sleeping in a warm bed. You are a German aerodynamicist, formerly employed by Junkers or Sabre. You think the worst is over, the war is done. You have a job working for the Soviet military administration, helping them restore factories. You think you are safe. Then the pounding on the door begins. You open it to find NKVD officers, their breath steaming in the cold October air. Behind them, trucks are idling in the street. "Pack," the officer says. "You have 15 minutes. You can take whatever you can carry." This was Operation Ossawavikim. In a single coordinated night, the Soviet Union liquidated the German aviation industry. They didn't just want the blueprints, they wanted the brains. At gunpoint, over 2,200 German specialists, engineers, mechanics, designers, along with their families and furniture, were loaded onto cattle cars. The trains rumbled east, deep into the heart of Russia. They were taken to isolated, closed cities like Podlipki and Kuibyshev. There were no trials, there were no executions. Instead, they were given drafting tables and a simple order: build us a jet force. These German captives found themselves in a bizarre golden cage. They were paid well, fed better than the average Russian, but they were prisoners. They worked alongside Soviet designers like Artem Mikoyan and Mikhail Gurevich. The collaboration was tense. The Russians were proud. They didn't want to just copy German designs, they wanted to surpass them. But they needed the German data on swept wings and high-speed airflow. The result of this forced marriage was a small, stubby fighter. It had the swept wings of a German prototype, the Ta-183, a British engine, foolishly sold to the Soviets by the Labour government, and a Russian cannon that could blow a bomber in half. They called it the MiG-15. The reunion over the Yalu fast-forward 4 years. The world has changed again. The Cold War has turned hot on the Korean peninsula. November 8, 1950, 20,000 feet above Sinuij, North Korea. An American flight of F-80 Shooting Stars straight-wing jets that look like holdovers from World War II is on a patrol mission. They are confident the U.S. Air Force rules the sky. The North Koreans are flying obsolete piston engine yaks that are easy prey. Then the radar pickets scream a warning. From high above, diving out of the sun, silver shapes streak down. They are moving so fast they look like blurs. They tear through the American formation, cannons flashing. The American pilots are stunned. What the hell was that? One shouts over the radio. They look like 262s. They were MiG-15s. The shock in the Pentagon was absolute. The Soviets, a nation the US generals dismissed as technologically backward peasants, had just fielded a jet fighter that was faster, climbed better, and flew higher than anything the Americans had. The panic button was hit. The F-86 Sabres were rushed from the US to Korea. And so, the stage was set for the ultimate irony of the 20th century. In the skies over MiG Alley, the F-86 Sabre and the MiG-15 clashed in the first great jet dogfights of history. To the pilots, it was democracy versus communism, but to an engineer looking at the silhouettes in the sky, it was something else entirely. It was something else entirely. It was a family feud. Both planes had swept wings. Both had automatic slats. Both had roots in the research of men like Adolf Bussmann and Alexander Lippisch. It was the left hand of the Luftwaffe fighting the right hand of the Luftwaffe, piloted by men who had defeated the Luftwaffe 5 years prior. The legacy of the German jets hadn't disappeared in the scrapyards of Freeman Field. It had simply bifurcated, the forgotten orphans. While the fighters stole the glory, a quieter, perhaps more profound revolution was happening elsewhere, born from the Lusty raids. Back in the US, the immense B-47 Stratojet bomber was taking shape. Boeing engineers had initially designed it as a straight-wing, propeller-driven plane. But after seeing the wind tunnel data from the German Vulcanroad facility, they swept the wings back 35 degrees and hung jet pods under the wings. Look at a modern airliner today. Look at a Boeing 747 or an Airbus A320. Look at the swept wings. Look at the swept wings. Look at the podded engines. That distinct silhouette, the shape of modern travel, traces its lineage directly back to that panicked redesign in 1945. But not every German idea was a winner. Some were dead ends that killed brave men. In the desperate search for vertical takeoff capabilities, VTOL, the Americans experimented with the captured Bachem-Bar 349 Natter technology rocket interceptors that launched vertically. It was a disaster. And then there were the flying wings. Remember the Horten Ho 229? The stealthy Batwing. Northrop continued to experiment with the flying wing concept in the late 40s with the YB-49. It was majestic, alien, and beautiful, but it was unstable. Without computers to correct the flight path, the flying wings tumbled out of the sky. The program was cancelled, the prototypes chopped up. The idea went into hibernation for 30 years. It sat in the archives, a ghost waiting for technology to catch up. It wouldn't be until the 1980s that the spirit of the Horten would rise again as the B-2 stealth bomber. As the 1950s rolled on, the actual German airframes, the metal and glass captured at such cost, began to vanish. They were dragged out of hangars to make room for the new jets they had helped create. They were left to rot in weed-choked fields behind museums or used as target practice for the very guns they inspired. By 1955, only a handful remained. The pilots who flew them had moved on. The pilots who flew them had moved on. The black men mechanics had either become US citizens, seamlessly blending into the suburbs of Alabama and Ohio, or had returned to a divided Germany. The physical evidence was fading, but one final mystery remained, a mystery buried deep in a crate that had never been opened, involving a technology so dangerous both the US and the Soviets were terrified to touch it. The Shape of Tomorrow and the Silence of the Museum, May 2nd, 1955. Edwards Air Force Base, California. The heat shimmering off the desert floor distorts the horizon. A strange triangular silhouette sits on the runway. It doesn't have the swept wings of the Sabre or the straight wings of the Mustang. It looks like a giant arrowhead. This is the Convair F-102 Delta Dagger. It is the first operational supersonic interceptor of the US Air Force with a Delta wing, and its existence answers the mystery of that unopened crate. Inside the crate, shipped from Germany 10 years prior, was the Lippisch DM-1. It wasn't a fighter, it was a glider, a chunky, ugly plywood triangle found by Patton's Third Army. But when American engineers at Langley placed it in a wind tunnel, the numbers were staggering. The German designer, Alexander Lippisch, had discovered that at extreme speeds, a triangle, a delta, was the most stable shape. The Americans took that plywood glider and turned it into the F-102, then the F-106, and eventually they scaled it up, added massive rocket engines, and painted it black. The SR-71 Blackbird, the fastest plane ever built, owes a nod to Lippisch. Look even further. Look at the Concorde, look at the space shuttle. The DNA of a dusty German glider found in a Bavarian barn is baked into the tiles of the spacecraft that ferried astronauts to orbit. The Luftwaffe's hardware was dead, but its geometry had conquered the world, the warehouse of forgotten dreams. But what of the original machines? The iron and aluminum survivors that Watson's Whizzers risked their lives to ferry across the Atlantic. For decades their fate was ignoble. 1970. Suitland, Maryland. The Paul E. Garber facility. You step into a dimly lit, corrugated metal warehouse. The air smells of old rubber, mildew, and decaying fabric. It is silent here, far removed from the thunder of the jet age. This is where the Smithsonian hid its treasures, not in the gleaming halls of the Air and Space Museum on the National Mall. There wasn't enough room. The surplus was sent here. As your eyes adjust to the gloom, you see them. They are stacked like firewood. There, covered in 20 years of dust, is the Horten Ho 2-turn 9 V3, the Batwing stealth fighter. It is disassembled, its wooden skin delaminating, its jet engine sitting on a pallet nearby. It looks like a broken toy. Next to it sits the fuselage of a Heinkel He 219. The radar antennas are bent. The cockpit glass is yellowed. And there is the Arado R-234, the only jet bomber of the war left in existence. It sits on flat tires, a ghost in the darkness. For years these machines were neglected. They were the losers of history. And nobody cares about the losers' weapons until enough time passes for the hate to fade into curiosity. But then, a shift occurred. As the generation that fought the war began to pass away, a frantic desire to preserve history took hold. Restoration teams moved in. They didn't just wash the planes, they performed forensic archaeology. When they peeled back the panels of the Heinkel He 162, they found the names of the slave laborers scrawled in chalk on the bulkheads. They found sabotage rivets that were intentionally loose, fuel lines meant to leak. These planes stopped being just trophies of technology. They became monuments to human suffering and hubris. The final flight. Today, if you walk into the Udvar-Hazy Center in Virginia or the Deutsches Museum in Munich, the survivors are there. They are pristine now. Glossy paint, polished canopies. They look ready to fly. But stand next to the Me-262 on display. Really look at it. Don't look at the sleek lines. Look at the rivets. They are uneven. Look at the rivets. They are uneven. Look at the nose gear. It's crude. This wasn't a machine built by a triumphant futuristic society. It was a machine built by a desperate, collapsing regime, assembled by starving prisoners, flown by teenagers who knew they probably wouldn't come back. The story of the Luftwaffe's planes after World War II isn't just about how America or Russia got jet technology. It's a story about the transition of power. The moment those planes landed at Cherbourg in 1945, the torch was passed. The era of European dominance in aviation ended, and the era of the superpowers began. We live in the world these planes created. Every time you board a Boeing 737 and look out at the swept wings slicing through the clouds, you are seeing the ghost of the Messerschmitt. Every time you see a rocket launch, you are seeing the legacy of the V-2. The Luftwaffe was destroyed in 1945, but in a strange, twisted irony, its creations won the future. August 2024, an air show in the Midwest. A roar tears the sky apart. The crowd gasps. It's not a modern F-35. It's a reproduction Me-262 built by a private company, powered by modern General Electric engines. It banks over the crowd, the shark-like profile unmistakable against the blue sky. For a brief second, the past and present collide. The ghost flies again, but this time there are no sirens, there are no bombs. There is only the appreciation of a machine that changed everything, and the silent acknowledgement of the terrible cost at which it was bought. The planes of the Luftwaffe were swords forged in the fires of hell. But when the war ended, we didn't beat them into plowshares. We used them to build the ladder to the stars.